Welcome, everyone, this is the inaugural Evident AI Symposium, and we are thrilled to be joined by so many leaders from across the banking sector, both here in the room, but also on our live stream today. We set up Evident almost 2 years ago to address the growing need for visibility of AI adoption across the major global banks. It was increasingly clear that AI had become existential to the sector, which we're going to talk about more later on. So in January, we launched the first ever public benchmark for AI adoption. And by doing so, created a way to identify the pathways to successful AI adoption, but also showcase where banks are making both short and long-term gains. So we've had in-depth conversations with almost all of the 50 banks in the index this year. So the program today is really a reflection of these conversations and what is currently top of mind of the leadership at the bank level. We have such a fantastic lineup of expert speakers today on stage, but also so many experts in the room here today. So really want to encourage lively debate, so please do raise your hand if you've got a question, catch my eye, and we'll get a microphone to you so you can ask your questions throughout the program. But before we welcome our opening keynote speaker, Teresa Heisenwerther, JP Morgan's newly appointed CDAO, we'll take you through some of the latest results from the Evident AI Index second edition that was released 2 weeks ago today. And then we're also going to have a conversation with Eric about trends and predictions in the sector. But finally, I really wanted to thank our amazing partners, EY, DeepSea, Cognizant, and Bloomberg, and for your invaluable support for getting us here today. So before handing over to Eric, I want to hand over to my co-founder, Annabel Ayles, who will take us through some of the key findings of the index.
Brilliant. Hi, everyone. So nice to have you all here and on the live stream as well. So as Alexandra said, we updated the Evident AI Index 2 weeks ago, and it feels like a very long time ago already. But the index is an outside-in assessment, so it's based on public data. It assesses each of the 50 banks on talent, innovation, leadership, and the transparency of their responsible AI activity. So I thought just to start off taking you through the key findings. So JP Morgan, they were ranked #1 in January. They've continued to rank #1 in this index. They're particularly strong on all elements of AI innovation and also the transparency of the responsible AI efforts at the bank. Capital One was a new entrant in November. They came in second very strongly, particularly strong on talent. They have a really high volume and density of AI talent at the bank. RBC came in third, the leading bank in Canada, and very consistent across all 4 pillars. And then if we just look slightly lower down to the top 10, you've got Wells Fargo, Goldman, and Citi, so the US banks all ranking strongly in the top 10. You've got UBS and ING from Europe also making the top 10 rankings. UBS have been very strong even after their Credit Suisse acquisition this year. They've gained a lot of AI talent from that. And then Commonwealth Bank of Australia and DBS were 2 of the new Asia-Pacific entrants that we brought into the ranking. Both of them very strong. DBS took the top spot on the leadership pillar. So they're very strong on the leadership and the transparency side. But obviously, the rankings only really tell part of the story. There's a lot that underpins the index, and I think this is just looking at the scores. So the index is scored from 0 to 100. And I think what you can see from this slide is that there's a lot of blobs on the left-hand side. So 45 out of the 50 banks score just under 40 points in the index. And then if you look on the right-hand side, you can see RBC coming in just over 50 points, Capital One coming in above 60, and then JP Morgan approaching 70. So those 3 leading banks are really sort of breaking away from the pack. I think it's an interesting question, what would happen if we put some of the big tech players on the ranking? I think that they would probably rank very highly on the right-hand side. So I think the 3 banks are breaking away, but I think there's definitely opportunity for them to continue to accelerate. So what's driving the rankings and what makes those 3 banks so particularly strong? So I sort of briefly mentioned at the beginning, and I'm sorry if you can't read the slide particularly well, but there are 4 pillars. So talent, innovation, leadership, transparency. And this slide shows the top 10 banks across each of the pillars. And I think the first thing to say is there are lots of banks on this slide. So there are 25 out of the 50 banks that rank in the top 10 in at least one pillar. So many banks have areas of strength. But the orange on this slide really shows the 3 leaders consistently scoring strongly across all 4 pillars. And JP Morgan in particular, they're top 3 on every pillar. And when you look at the 10 sub-pillars that underpin these 4 areas, they're consistently in the top 3. So they have a unique level of consistency. And what that means is they've really invested in AI talent. They have a strong volume and density of AI development, model risk, data engineering talent. They've invested in initiatives to hire and retain and develop that talent. On innovation, they've built AI research teams, they're filing patents, they're investing in acquiring tech and AI companies and actively contributing to the open source ecosystem. On leadership, it's really about having a CEO at the top of the bank championing the AI agenda, a CIO on the operating committee who's consistently beating the drum and being very explicit about the bank's use cases and the bank's outcomes. And I think obviously at JPMC, we've saw the appointment of Teresa as CDAO on the operating committee this summer. And that was an interesting and great move, and we'll hear more about that soon. And then the 4th pillar is transparency. So obviously banks are highly regulated. There's so much going on internally, a lot of governance. But what the leading banks on this pillar are doing is they're going above and beyond. They're hiring dedicated responsible AI leaders, data and AI ethics teams. They're publishing thought leadership. They're establishing RAI-related partnerships, and they're essentially spearheading and driving their responsible AI agenda publicly. So if there's one thing that I guess to say about all of this is that the leaders are consistent. I think they understand that to be AI mature is an investment across all areas of the bank. And while banks across the sector have really invested in AI over the last year, I think it's going to be a sort of multi-year effort to really catch up with those that are ahead of the pack. I'll hand over to Alexandra.
Thank you, Annabel. So just going back to the rankings, one of the things that was really striking and perhaps not so surprising was to see the dominance of the North American banks at the top of the index. So out of the top 18 banks, I don't know how easy it is to see, but there's also the program and the report on your chairs. But out of the top 18 banks, 12 were North American, and only 4 European banks in the mix, which was interesting. And so, of course, we get the question of why is that? Why are the North American banks so dominant? A couple of reflections on that we've seen through the data and sort of looking back over the last handful of years. Well, one is that the US banks were really first out the gate in terms of identifying an AI strategy and being very clear about that. Really doubling down on investing in innovation capabilities. So as Annabel was mentioning before, into research and patents, into partnerships, both tech partnerships and university partnerships, but also into investing in AI companies. And what we also saw was that the European banks didn't have that AI strategy made clear, not even last year, not across the board, but that was sort of a general sort of takeaway. But that is changing, and we've seen a major shift in the European banks, but also in the US banks that had AI strategies are refining them, or the banks that didn't have one are coming out and being much more clear about the communication of what they're doing in terms of looking at the spend, looking at the use cases in production, and looking at the return on investment. But one of the other factors that we also noted with the US banks were probably that they were quicker to recover from the financial crisis, so a bit more on the front foot, and had the sort of the bandwidth to focus on AI investment was one other reason. And then also that sort of more dominated by investment banks in the US that have been leaning more heavily into AI. So sort of those reasons among those that we think is our hypothesis why the US banks are leading in that. But I also just wanted to run through a few predictions that something that we're going to talk about with Eric in a minute, but getting up on screen sort of because so much of as Annabel said, so much data underpinning this, millions of data points that we gather and track on a we produce the index once a year, but between that we sort of really mine the data for what are sort of looking forward, what are the trends and the activity going on in between the index releases. So here are just 5 key sort of takeaways that we've sort of been thinking about when we looked at the results and looked at the data and sort of looking forward and what we expect is going to happen in the next year. So very quickly, one, we think generative AI is going to move from promise to reality. This has been a very quiet year. Many banks have been much more cautious in announcing generative AI use cases in production. We were actually expecting that this was going to materialize in terms of announcements in Q3 and Q4, but there's been hesitancy for good reason. We think that we're going to see a lot more announcements of generative AI specific use cases in production in the coming year, but really starting to see that having an impact on the bottom line in 2025. The second point is that we think that AI strategies are going to proliferate with depth, and much more depth and detail. What we mean by that is that this has been a year of really thinking about where are we on our AI strategy, what are we doing, do we centralize, how do we organize ourselves better? And that will probably start materializing and being much more explicit about that for both external and internal stakeholders. So much more detail around the strategy that the banks are pursuing, much more clarity on spend, as I said before, on return on investment, on use cases in production. Third, AI leaders are elevated to operating committees. We've seen that, as Annabel mentioned, and Teresa, CDO put on the exec committee. Only 4 banks do that. We expect that as the thinking matures on AI strategy, this is going to be an obvious next step for the banks leaning into this and pulling ahead. Not only just for a centralized way of organizing AI across the entirety of the bank, but also creating more nimbleness and this whole focus on getting the time to production down. This is one of the very important steps in that initiative. Fourth, AI initiatives yield meaningful ROI, and so that is something that obviously is A, hard to measure. B, we are expecting to see that coming through more and more. Obviously, that's taking place in the banks in terms of measurement, but becoming much more clear around how to do that and looking more broadly, not just at the revenue, but other KPIs that go into the consideration of ROI, and that being expressed more clearly going forward, and that really hitting the bottom line towards the end of next year and definitely in 2025. Last, but not least, bifurcation is something that we spend a lot of time talking about. What that means is that we expect to see a growing gap between the leaders in the index and the laggards. We see this not only being a US phenomenon, but it is something that we watch very carefully here, but really across the board. The banks that are at the top end of the index and doubling down will pull ahead, and they have a first mover advantage. The banks lower down the index and are hesitating. It might be difficult to catch up, and we expect that gap might grow. That said, we also talk about second mover advantage. Is it good to be a follower? Could be, but it still means that there needs to be a lot of focus and thinking around what the strategy is and really leaning into that. And with that, I'm going to hand over to you, Eric.
Thanks, Alexandra. Hi, everybody. My name is Eric Schatzker. I'm the editorial director of Bloomberg New Economy. As Alexandra mentioned earlier, Bloomberg is one of Evident's partners here at the Symposium. We're delighted to be here. You'll see me and several of my colleagues up here on stage hosting interviews and moderating panel discussions. And just a few days ago, we were talking about how best to share with you the findings of the Evident Index. And Alexandra and Annabel kindly invited me to sit here with them and sort of debrief them, as it were, on some of their thoughts, because some of the thought that goes into this isn't obvious in the index itself and the publication that you have in your hands. Now, it feels awfully timely to have, if we were judging timeliness strictly by news flow, it's extremely timely. And so it leaves me with some curiosity, and I, by the way, don't know the answer to this question yet. Why do this? What's the origin story of the Evident Index? How did you come up with the idea for this? Presumably, it was a while ago, and it took a little while to develop this, and it just so happens that you're out right now with something that's extremely relevant.
Yeah, well, you would have thought we'd have timed it, and we knew what was coming, but I can't say we were that clever. But we definitely, maybe a little bit of the backstory, because that's quite relevant in terms of sort of how we've built the index. So we've actually been in the space of AI measurement for more than half a decade. So in 2018, we built something, the Global AI Index, which was the first ever measurement of nations on the strength of their AI ecosystems. And it was, more of a geopolitical question about US versus China, UK, Canada, Israel, Singapore, and so on, and what it meant to be leaning in and investing in national capabilities of AI deployment and development. And from that, and that got released in 2018, so we've been really knee-deep in this engine room of both figuring out how do you measure something this nebulous? What is the concept of it? What are the key components that go into this ecosystem? And so from that, we then got into conversations with businesses around, and especially banks going from a phase of exploration and sort of testing to really focusing on what is actually the value proposition of AI investment. And so that became a growing demand. Could we take the concept of what we had done on the national level and use it on the business level? And that was the birth of our, 2 years ago, setting up Evident and building this first benchmark on AI adoption.
So why banks?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think to touch on what Alexandra was saying, I think banks have been experimenting and investing in AI for a long time. I think, when you look at some of the early announcements, I think from RBC and Dave Mackay and Jamie Dimon, it was sort of back in about 2015, 2016 when the big banks started saying, this is going to be a real priority for us, we need to make these investments. But I think that when we speak to the banks, so many of them have been, until really 18 months ago, have been focused really on individual use cases, experimenting with particular use cases and particular business units. And I think the power of an index is really to sort of force everyone really to take a step back and say, is that enough? Do we need to be thinking about, is it enough to sort of be delivering value in particular areas and sort of gradually scaling them up? Or do we need to be thinking about this slightly differently? So we felt like it was the right time to sort of take on the banks and see if we could inspire, I guess, a more top-down approach.
Is there an answer to that question yet?
What about whether they can?
Yes.
Well, I think it's interesting. I think that when we look at the rankings, like the North American banks, as Alexandra was saying, have definitely for a long time maybe thought about this in a bit more of a top-down way. I think when we speak to the European banks, and actually to be fair, every bank in the index that we've spoken to, it is a laser focus on outcomes. But I think that when we speak to European banks, there are some that are thinking, maybe we do need to invest more in an R&D team. Maybe we do need to try and position ourselves more as a peer to a big tech company like Microsoft to attract that talent. So I think that I think there's sort of slightly different approaches taken. And I think that over the course of the next year, we want to start looking at outcomes a lot more. So really getting into the weeds of what use cases are banks focusing on, how are they delivering value for the bank. So arguably at the moment, there are different strategies that banks are deploying. Some are more use case by use case led, some are more top-down focused. And maybe time will tell when we start looking at the outcomes, whether one approach is better than the other.
Alexandra, earlier you shared with us some of your observations, but I'm curious to know what both of you found most surprising about the results.
Yeah, well, a couple of things. I think, it was interesting to see Annabel mentioned that the Canadian banks were a lot of the Canadian banks that sit at the top end of the index.
You do know I'm Canadian, right?
I didn't know that.
This is not
no. Well, flattery gets you a long way, right? So, but actually, you're really good in Canada on your AI commercialization. But it really made us think about what is this interplay between a really conducive policy environment and the ability for businesses, not only banks, but business AI adoption. And we see that link. I mean, the Canadian government has been very focused, as has the Singaporean government, on pushing for the support of AI commercialization and AI adoption. That means, all kinds of supported mechanisms, that is, partnership with the universities and talent development, and something that the UK, I'm sure everyone's followed, but really has talked about with the UK AI Safety Summit. You also need to really focus on that, the conducive policy environment, but also the talent that you develop and so on. So I think that what we're seeing, and also we see from the index that they're very strong on transparency and also on the responsible AI side. And we think that also comes from that environment and the supportive, and the focus of the government. So that was one of the surprises. The other one, I think, just quickly to mention, again, what Annabel was going through, we started this index looking at the top 23 banks, the biggest banks in North America and Europe in January. And then we added another 27, and those are smaller banks. And so we were sort of thinking it's going to be interesting when we press the button and run the index to see where it lands. You would think that actually being a big bank is an advantage. But what we saw was actually that of the smaller banks, three sat in the top 10. You've got Capital One is second, you've got DBS coming in, and you've got Commonwealth Bank of Australia coming in, smaller banks. So that actually, diffuses this notion that it's only with a lot of resource that you can be really progressive on your AI strategy. You can be a small bank, and if you focus on that for a long, and you get the AI strategy right, you can do incredibly well.
I'm sure it feels good for those of you who represent banks in the top 10 to rank as highly as you did. doesn't feel so good to rank in the bottom 10. What kind of a response and reaction have you had from the banks themselves?
I'll do one of those, then I'll send it. I will name no names. But it has been, the banks, it has been a very sort of we know we're not on the front foot. We know this is a very accurate reflection of what we are as a bank in terms of our AI profile. That's
like looking in the mirror.
Is it like looking in the mirror? We do a 360 of the banks on their entirety of their AI footprint, really. And when you're ranked 46, 7, 8, what we hear most often is actually that's really accurate. And what the index helps do is it creates some kind of a pathway to what is the sequence, what do we need to look for, what do we need to do internally and externally, what is the checklist, and here's the checklist. And but some, and I would say maybe I can say that the Nordic banks are particularly low in the index, which was really surprising to me. I'm Danish, just by because it is a very innovative culture. And it was something I would expect to see that feed through to the Nordic banks, but because it's a very very isolated market, there's not a lot of competitive pressure, so there hasn't been that need to really go hell for leather on their AI strategy.
Do you have a sense yet as to whether those results to which you just referred, banks that may not have ranked so well, whether those results have helped to raise the urgency level at those institutions and perhaps put this more front and center in the C-suite?
Yeah, I mean, I think from my perspective, it sort of actually doesn't really matter where you rank in the index. I think it's sort of like to your point, it's holding up a mirror to what they look like from the outside. So I think even if you're a bank at the top, you've got people nipping at your heels, and if you're a bank at the bottom, absolutely, I think banks look at the index and the checklist of all the 100+ metrics that we look at, and they say, okay, what are the other banks doing that we're not doing? What could we be doing better? And I think particularly on obviously there's the talent and there's the innovation pillar, and I think the index has sparked lots of thoughts on the innovation side as to, okay, like should we be building research teams? How do we need to be thinking about our venture strategy and things like that? But also on the transparency side, so like the leadership pillar and the responsible AI pillar, so many banks say to us, but we're doing this internally, but we're not making it public. And we obviously can't take that into account because we can't sort of cut through what's real or what's not. But I think they're really thinking, okay, if AI is going to be this holistic sort of transformation and it's going to be such a powerful force, maybe we need to be bringing our internal and external stakeholders on the journey with us.
I think we should talk for a moment about responsibility and accountability as it concerns AI in the banking industry. You both believe, and I'm quoting them directly here, that transparency is critical to harnessing the value of AI for commercial and societal gain. But I will note, and you can see for yourselves, that a number of banks that otherwise look very strong in artificial intelligence scored quite poorly on transparency. What does that reveal?
Well, first of all, just maybe a step back here on the transparency. One of sort of the core to the index is actually forcing open this black box of AI adoption, and transparency is incredibly important, not just for the banks in it, but for everyone looking to adopt AI, and having that clarity of what the various pathways to success are. Transparency is absolutely critical for that. So that's sort of a bigger, sort of more sort of macro sense of the transparency question. But there are sort of two key components to the index. One is capabilities that we measure, and the other one is visibility, right? And so that's part of the transparency. So being transparent on what you're doing is, in a sense, in and of itself, a marker of maturity. So what we see the leading banks do is that there's a lot of thought gone into what the strategy is and how it's being executed and what's coming out of it. So much so that there's a point in which that there's a readiness to talk about it. And the banks that haven't got that readiness in place are not ready to talk about it. So that transparency is, in and of itself, a marker for success.
And can I add one more thing, which I think is that the transparency pillar, right, is the fourth pillar. And when you look at the data, just so much of the data that underpins that is actually blank. Like, That's not like, that's actually not a good way of saying it. But generally speaking, there's not that much, like there are many metrics where not all 50 banks are doing it. And you find a big difference between those that are trying to sort of drive that responsible AI agenda and those that aren't. But I think we should also say that the ones that aren't being that transparent, particularly on the responsible AI side, it doesn't mean they're not necessarily doing it. Like banks are so highly regulated. There are so many like governance processes, so much going on internally that we can't see. But what our point is that if you're not making that visible and if you're not sort of championing the responsible and the ethical AI agenda, you're not going to be building trust. And if you're going to be making big investments in AI, you need to sort of be explaining what you're doing and making sure it's being done responsibly and bringing your customers, your clients, your investors on the journey with you.
This question is going.
Oh, sorry, and also just
talent.
from talent perspective. I think so many people that are really working at the cutting edge of AI really, and everyone really cares about responsibility and ethics. So I think if banks aren't being vocal about, you know, how important that is for the bank and what they're doing, I think they'll struggle to hire the talent that they maybe want to hire.
The question around responsibility and ethics is, I think, it's fair to say, staring us all in the face, thanks to the attention we've paid to what's been going on at OpenAI these past few days. On the whole, based on your experiences with all of these banks and what you know about other industries, how does banking rank on responsibility and ethics in AI?
It is, it's a great question. I would say that it's a very, to Annabel's point, the banks are so heavily regulated, so much is done in terms of oversight already, right? From model development, oversight, testing, first, second, third lines of defense, sending that through to regulators, that being tested. So in some ways, the banking sector is potentially the blueprint for how to organize and how to think about how to regulate AI, generally speaking. And that I think is just looking at how the regulators are considering what to do with, but that's sort of more on the existential risk and what's coming out in terms of AI development towards AGI, thinking about guardrails and how to control that and how to manage that. Again, looking back at how the banks, from a sector perspective, how the banks are doing it is very much something that could be a blueprint for the way to think of it, and a blueprint for how unregulated sectors should be thinking about how to manage AI risk. Is
For you both, before we move on in our program, you mentioned it briefly, Annabel. Outcomes is one of the things that you're working on. What comes next? What should we look forward to?
Well, so over the next year, I think we're going to be doubling down on the banking sector. I think there's just so, like, the more we get into it, the more complicated it is and the more we want to do. So we're definitely going to be looking to build an outcomes benchmark. We're probably speaking to, I think 15 banks are pretty interested in participating in that. So that would be on an anonymous basis, trying to compare use cases and outcomes. But I think long term, I was a geologist, so for me, I want to just build the biggest map of AI adoption across global business.
The mining industry can't wait.
Yeah, exactly.
they're next.
Yeah, they're next.
next.
But yeah, across all sectors, essentially, cross-sector expansion.
Probably, just sort of really looking at the horizon, the last session we have today is going to be on quantum. And there's a small part of our team that are really itching to do a quantum index as well. So that's probably on the horizon, but probably not next year, but maybe the following year.
Excellent. Shall we move on?
Yes. Thank
Great.
you so much.
Thank you so much.
Eric. Thank you.